You may have read or heard of a German term, Gesamtkunstwerk, forgive pronunciation, which is popularly translated into English as total work of art. One at least imagines a work which is completely elevated, a magnificent demonstration of the prowess of its medium, a soaring experience, a sublime culmination of cultural aesthetics into an apotheosis of the preceding centuries of human discourse, or logos if we want to get a little trippy. And I think we may as well. We've just dropped into a hotel room in sweaty Saigon. The doors are performing in our brain. It feels like 1970 is being assessed in a 1979 film via Conrad's text, Heart of Darkness. The total work of art is a concept which is associated with Richard Wagner, and it is not a stretch to assume that Coppola was composing Apocalypse Now with this in mind, given the most iconic use of Wagner in culture occurs within this film. Not only emblematic of the more sinister usages of Wagner's art in human history, but evoking the history of the film medium itself in a moment which preceded even the Nazis' malignant rise. In 1915, D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation scored the charge of the Ku Klux Klan, the heroes of its even then vastly controversial storyline, to Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries. What appears to be a conscious parallel is possibly more akin to, or comes across as, a more sweeping exposure of an American exceptionalist pathos. It doesn't make one consider that the American experiment's uglier characteristics and tendencies have re-emerged, but rather that it never really ceased and has now swelled to the point of spreading overseas. But also, I consider now, in this moment here, Apocalypse Now is the true culmination of not only New Hollywood, but of the 1960s counterculture in general. I don't know if there was any going back from the Gothic realities, the forceful residue of the Vietnam War, on the hippie movement's psyche. It almost seems disrespectful to Apocalypse Now and Francis Coppola to remain a hippie after the film's conclusion. Why would I suggest this? Not for the film is remotely pro-war, although I wonder if it passed Truffaut's test. Even if it would, I'm not sure if he would have wanted it to, I suspect, for some submerged envy perhaps. But rather because the hippie ideals come across as so binary, denialism or plain wrong, not the intentions perhaps. Of course, many just enjoyed the sex or drugs, not that that ought to be shamed in and of itself, but it feels as though one must choose to, or place a prism of interpretation over one's organic processing psyche that allows one to remain a staunch hippie. Or one could just condemn the film as an overwrought spectacle glorifying war, inferior to smaller films, the independent films of the 1980s, Jarmusch, Jost, Rappaport. Maybe it got too popular with Tarantino, Soderbergh, Jones and the gang. But those smaller films are probably preferred, for a while there, for some. Me, I cannot feel anything but a reverence for Apocalypse Now. Kudos to this film for apparently inspiring a young Noel Oakeshott to explore more critically acclaimed cinema, as this allowed myself to eventually explore more films which I otherwise, being an asocial anchorite, wouldn't know where to find, whom to communicate with, silly social things that are inferior to watching films, typically. Every sequence in this film might be one of my favourites in the history of the form, although I find that the final scene of the French plantation sequence, the one that loves, one that kills trait, is a bit irritating and unimpressive writing, in my opinion. Yeah, I'm talking about when I watch Apocalypse Now, it's Redux, by the way. Everything else in the French plantation sequence I like, with the exception of the final scene there. I think a lot of other people feel that way too. The bridge sequence, that's so imprisoning, mesmerizing. On top of all of this, it did a superior job to most of the Vietnam War films from the American studios at depicting the suffering of the Vietnamese and Cambodians as the most quantitatively devastating of the entire conflict. I do not mean to bemoan 1986's Platoon too much, although I have my critiques of it, especially compared with Apocalypse Now, and also Full Metal Jacket, but that's maybe for another upload. Now, I feel quite awful saying that. I know Oliver Stone was a veteran of that evil war. I would imagine that the film is extremely, to degrees which I will never, really hope never, to understand, maybe profoundly personal to Stone himself, although I find the film to be overwhelmingly Hollywood, in the execution of it, rather than the content of the film itself. Clearly, Full Metal Jacket conveys a more naked and unromantic depiction of war. Not that violence itself is being romanticized in Platoon, although the machinery of big-budget Hollywood war films is. Samuel Fuller's war films had a certain ruthlessness about them. You would not find anything in The Longest Day or even Paths of Glory, Ray's Bit of Victory, Pretty It May Be, or All Quiet on the Western Front, which is as honest about war at one time as Fuller's work in The Steel Helmet or Fixed Bayonets. Those films are pretty ugly, or later on, 1980, you had The Big Red One. Fuller was a World War II veteran and insisted upon a touch of realism in his films depicting the war. against studio's insistence at times. They are blunt, if they are aestheticized, it is to be straight and callous, a particular mode of stylization, although not a very romantic or attractive one. Remember that last line of The Longest Day? Well, somebody's shooting somebody. Let's go find us some war. They could have inserted it at the end of Apocalypse Now or any other Vietnam War picture of that era, the more anti-war, if you will, films, and it would have been considered a display of a character thoroughly traumatized into needing the adrenaline of warfare and violence, as Martin Sheen's character of Willard outlines during the iconic opening monologue. Anyway, to contrast, again, a film like The Longest Day to Samuel Fuller's films, to those who may be versed in the old World War II movies from America or from the UK, there's plenty of British war pictures, most of Jack Hawkins, all of them with John Mills. Those ones, the Samuel Fuller films, would stand out, I think, as rather brutal and unforgiving in comparison to the more glorifying romantic ventures of a John Wayne, Gary Cooper, or Gregory Peck film. Apocalypse Now represents a kind of odyssey. See the journey down the Nung River, it's a fictional river, as an analogous river Styx into hell, or into the beginning of time itself, as Colonel Kurtz has found what he believes is the end of existence, the last state of consciousness before closure, before one is finally ready, willing, and eager to face the final severance. It is not meant to be a realistic war film, obviously using the setting of the war in Indochina as a basis to recreate Conrad's classic text, Heart of Darkness. It is not the honest to the point of being near irresponsibly traumatic, as Klimov's Come and See is, nor is it too sanitized or ignorantly gung-ho. It couldn't star John Wayne. It doesn't suffer from what I consider to be the potential artistic excesses of Stone's Platoon, though I feel uneasy about that opinion for no other reason, again, that Stone's own life circumstances, however. And nor does it pioneer, though Platoon may have, the overbearing editing and sensory smothering of Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan, which quite willingly turned into an action film at the end, since that demented stabbing scene. Apocalypse Now, I think, managed to balance the precarious challenges of a war picture and emerges, I would claim, as successfully as any war film could ever hope to, artistically, without... Whether we want to factor the anti-war... its success as an anti-war film into this is dubious, although I don't consider any scene in Apocalypse Now to be particularly glorifying of war, violence, anything in Apocalypse Now that could be considered properly in the way that other war films have them, including a Saving Private Ryan, maybe not even a Platoon, but an action scene. Even Full Metal Jacket has a sequence or two that could be cast as an action sequence in a way that Apocalypse Now does not. I could, to my memory at least, anyway. But of course, Apocalypse Now, yes, it does not depict the traumas of violence as Klimov's Come and See had. That film has the most claim in my mind of being the war film which definitely does oppose war and cannot remotely glorify war. However, I would hold up Coppola's Apocalypse Now as a film which used a war in history as the backdrop for the retelling, recreation, modern sublation of a very canonized text, and the film which possibly most displayed artistically the current state of the human species as of 1979. It's kind of remarkable then that if Apocalypse Now isn't my favorite or the most impressive film of 1979, it's Tarkovsky's Stalker. I think these two films being released in the same year, both films couldn't have emerged without the presupposed occurrences of phenomenal human suffering, the American invasion of Indochina, or the ruthless misery that was life in the Soviet Union in the case of Tarkovsky. Although, at least with those two profound works of art, we found some justification, even throughout all the suffering, of our species' merit. I mean, we really needed some at that point, I think. Hey, any detractors of Apocalypse Now, please speak. Any other devoted admirers of this classic film, if one is inclined, also speak. It deserves to be praised for the rest of time. Coppola has earned it. Love it, hate it, it will inspire incredibly strong opinions in any individual.
Howdy do, I'm Colonel Kurtz, fat and bald like old Fred Mertz. Watch me do a hula dance to shake the egg rolls from my pants.
He's not so bad, he's really just an odd man.
And I shaved my head like Dennis Rodman.
He's a god man.